Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair. Let's talk about that old adage, never judge a book by its cover. Ostensibly, it's supposed to teach you to never judge anything based on appearances, but I find that to be kind of flawed, because while with people there is a lot of gray area and you shouldn't judge people purely based on appearances, in my experience, a lot of people do judge books by their covers, myself included. And a cover, when done right, can tell you a lot about a story. It's why I always talk about the covers, except when I don't have a cover to talk about. In the case of today's book, I picked this book up back at New York Comic Con 2017. Probably the exact same day I got that advanced copy of Tess of the Road. This one was also a freebie, but from the Harper booth. When I bought the Welcome to Night Vale novel, I was sent to a secondary table with a bunch of books on it that I could choose from for free. And my eyes immediately gravitated to this one, for two reasons. Reason one, what the hell is that thing on the cover? And two, what the hell is a Noumenon? So I chose this, but I had a lot of other books on my plate, and it got lost in the shuffle. And then last year, I was between books, and I randomly picked this up off the shelf and decided to give it a read. And it was amazing. Remember how enthusiastic I was about The Martian back in 2016? I feel pretty much the same way about Noumenon, but I didn't want to rehash the same opening joke. Really, this video could just be me for 5 seconds going, go read this book, but I have a feeling that you're expecting a full review, so, without further ado, this is Noumenon. The cover is gorgeous. We've got this big ovally thing, which is actually the main spaceship of the expedition convoy, which is so cool, along with several of the smaller spaceships buzzing around it. There's something about the light grids that look almost crystalline, and the greenish-blue color scheme that I really love it. And we've got one review on the cover, which is sort of distracting, but I'll forgive it because we've got the title and author's name, Noumenon, and then Marina J. Lofstetter front and center where it should be and where it really catches the eye. Not at the top, not at the bottom, not off in a corner, front and center. Why aren't there more book covers like this? This is like the best modern book cover that I had ever seen, ever. And the back even has a proper blurb, so I'm like doubly impressed. And it's like Noumenon gets carte blanche on awesome covers, because even the alternate and international covers look amazing too, despite being a tad more minimalist. Anyway, before I spend the entire video gushing about the cover, let's get to the story itself. The story is told in several vignettes, and the first one begins with Reggie Strafer, an astrophysicist PhD student who discovers a really weird star in the sky, LQ Pix, or Lick Pix as Reggie calls it, that's really far away from Earth, and so he proposes his idea for a manned space mission to journey to the star and study it up close, believing it to be special. The Planet United Consortium is in charge of deciding on all space missions, and has several planned missions set aside, known as convoys, due to the fact that each mission has several dedicated ships that work in tandem, one for living, one for food storage, etc. So I suppose that one could say that they've got a great big convoy rocking through the night. I'm sorry, that joke was... it was just terrible. I'll escort myself out. Anyway, Reggie hopes to get his accepted onto the list. It's accepted by the Consortium and is their 7th manned mission, so Convoy 7 is sent on Mission Noumenon.
He said it! He said it!
However, they're not quite at Star Trek level of warp engines yet. They use subdimensional engines, which means that there's a disconnect between the time passing on the ship and the time passing back on Earth. A pretty sizable disconnect, where a lifetime passes on Earth in only a few years on the convoy, which is meant to be made up of 9 fully stocked and staffed ships, and they can't account for the well-being of volunteers and their descendants that far in advance, so the mission is undertaken in a different way. With clones. They pick their best and brightest of the types of people they need to go on the mission, and they clone them, with the mission being sent off with a group of trained clones, and then the clones raise new clones and replace them when they get too old, and so on and so forth until it gets back to Earth after studying the star. The convoy itself will be made up of several ships with unique purposes, some for research, some for food and resource production, and all the other necessary things that they'll need being so far from Earth. But Reggie throws in a unique element. He has a special AI named C, basically a sentient version of Siri or Alexa, though most of his type have gone the way of the dodo for reasons revolving around the march of progress and people just simply growing out of them. Reggie wants the lead programmer of the mission, Jamal Caden, to program his C's base code into the ship, becoming the Interconvoy Computer, ICC for short, which would help the ship during its journey. But Reggie secretly loads ICC with his C's memories, set to fully integrate after the convoy launches. That AI integration is gonna bite him in the ass, ain't it? They prep the mission on the clones, while all the originals live their lives on Earth, with Reggie overseeing part of the development along with Akane Nakamura, an engineer, and Diego Santabar, a resource specialist, all of whom are donating their DNA to be cloned. You can see why their genes were chosen. They can perform specific tasks, although humorously, Reggie's genes are set to work in leadership instead of research, despite the original having been the one who discovered lick picks in the first place. Once everything is set, the clones are raised, first by foster families. In the case of Margarita Pavon, she was raised by her genetic donor before moving into a communal living space in Iceland, with all the other clones to be taught their vocation. In an interesting twist, they're not forced to follow rigid, non-fun lives. They're allowed pop culture. We get references to Big Brother, not that one, and West Side Story from Margarita. Once they're all trained and the ships are built and stocked, Convoy 7 is sent out on her far longer than 5-year mission to study lick picks. Over the course of the novel, we get several vignettes featuring different generations of clones as time passes on the ship. There are several controversies that occur at each vignette, the first major problem being relatively shortly after their departure, with the major disconnect from Earth causing a rise in depression and suicides that were expected by the Captain Mahler, the only original DNA donor on the ship, which concerns Margarita more than it concerns Mahler. Other issues arrive some years later, when a clone of Jamal Caden takes particular umbrage with the convoy's strict rules about conservation of energy and resources that requires anyone above a certain age to be euthanized. Think Half a Life from Star Trek The Next Generation. A clone of Diego Santabar, who Jamal really likes, is forced to undergo it, and while he's made peace, Jamal has not. And when he gets older, he attempts a coup to force the convoy to head back to Earth, and circumvents ICC, who had taken a liking to Jamal, and so ignored all the signs that Jamal was the only person capable of organizing the revolt.
Curse your sudden but inevitable betrayal!
ICC performs a shutdown to prevent Jamal from taking over the ship, waking up years later to discover that the revolt was quelled and all the perpetrators were discontinued, meaning that their DNA will never again be used to create clones. 20 years into the mission, Reginald Strafer IV is in command of the convoy, and they're about to finally arrive, finding the star to be man-made, and in the middle of the giant web, based on scans and appearances, to be an incomplete ship. And that's why the star was strange enough to grab the original Reggie's attention. While learning about it, the convoy decides to study the work and try to follow up based on what's there. However, their time is finite, and they still have to bring their findings back to Earth at some point as well. However, during that process, Strafer has a mental breakdown, believing that they should turn away and never return, spurred on by supposed visions he was receiving from the seed at the center of the web, and dies of an aneurysm. 20 years further along, ICC shows signs of evolution, like the EMH from Voyager, where he starts to become more than just a computer program. He even writes poetry.
Ode to Spot. Felis catus,
is your taxonomic nomenclature.
Although, that's not too far off. ICC's poem is based on how everyone he interacts with is the same person, yet different than their predecessor or descendants. Following that, they begin to head back to Earth, but the SD drive malfunctions, and one of the convoy bottomless, the storage ship, is lost, making the rest hesitant to use SD ever again, so they proceed at normal speed towards Earth out of fear. Hey, it's a better explanation than all the quantum slipstream engines and warp 10 stuff that Voyager just forgot about. Nearly 40 years on, some of the discontinued DNA has been used to create a prison called the Pit. 4 expendable work details, sort of like the Canaries from Red Dwarf. Even the Warden's discontinued. Mahler, whose third clone had succumbed to suicide, and as a result had been discontinued. The latest Margarita secretly cloned a new Jamal under the pretense of him being a Diego clone, and raised him as such, intending to show the ship that so-called discontinued lines could be reintegrated into society outside the Pit. Unfortunately, the Warden doesn't agree, and when he spots Diego out in the open, he tries to eliminate him. However, Margarita prevails, and the Warden, once he realizes who he is, kills himself, leading to both the reintegration, though in a way that creates a stratification between the different classes of DNA, and to the convoys finally getting over their fear of the SD drive and starting using them again. Naturally, this speeds up their return to Earth, which they haven't been able to contact in centuries, so they don't know what they're gonna find, and what they find is nothing. No response on any form of known frequency or language, including Welsh. They land in Antarctica, and the landing team, led by Nika Marov, is approached by 6 robots that only understand sign language but don't communicate. The robots bring them to an underground city where they find humans, but humans who can't communicate with them, before meeting Afenza, the ambassador who is an expert in 20th century languages and is aware of who they are. They interact with the governing body of Earth, but it's clear that Earth's government doesn't really care about their mission. It's been so long and Earth has changed so much, but the convoy is willing to reintegrate into society and give this new Earth a chance. 35 years later, Esperanza Strafer, daughter of Nika and a Reggie Strafer clone, is embroiled in the middle of a schism where the convoy crews are having trouble reintegrating and so decide that they want to go back into space and make their lives there, planning to head back to LQ Pix to finish what they and another long-gone race started. The only problem is that Earth wants ICC to experiment on because all their non-biological AI projects have gone kaput. But Esperanza manages to fake a fire that allows her to remain on Earth, which she prefers since she didn't have as much trouble integrating as everyone else, and let the convoy return to the stars, heading back to the web to study it, and possibly finish it as the novel ends. So we don't technically follow any characters through the entire story except for ICC, which is an interesting character to follow, being that we get sort of a Data/EMH arc out of them, with them gaining sentience and sapience as the novel goes on. The fact that there's a whole section dedicated to the poem and to the fact that ICC developed enough of a connection to that Jamal Caden clone that they overlooked the revolt until it was too late. I know I said that the AI integration would bite them in the ass near the start, and I want to be clear. I wrote that line while I was reading the book back in November of last year. Literally, I was sitting outside a classroom reading the book, I got to that page, read about ICC, and immediately took out my phone and notated on a Google Doc. Page 42. That AI integration is gonna bite them in the ass, ain't it? And I legitimately thought that was the direction the story was going to go. It was going to go the HAL 9000 route, where it would take over the mission, but instead we got a benevolent and kind AI, where it ultimately saved the mission because unlike the clones, ICC had the benefit of hindsight and remembering instead of just being told its history. I didn't think I'd come to love an artificial intelligence in this book as much as I did, but I think ICC was my favorite character out of everyone. I also found the clones to be a very fascinating concept, because while we follow the same names around, we're not following the same characters. I don't know if it's like this for everyone, but when I read, I tend to get attached to all the characters, and I don't like having to say goodbye, but With Noumenon, it's different. It's very similar in a way to Doctor Who, though in the way that the characters we follow aren't the same characters in each segment. It's like how, despite playing the Doctor, Hartnell's interpretation varies wildly from, say, Tom Baker's or Jodie Whittaker's. Yet, you can have a certain affinity for a specific version or absolutely despise one, but not let that opinion change your feelings on the earlier or later versions. For example, I really like the first Captain Mahler, despite his aloofness in regards to the suicides, but I hated the Warden version, as you were likely supposed to. But I found it to be a very interesting dichotomy, and not one that I think I've ever personally seen done in prose before. I can both love and hate essentially the same character, and they're also distinct from each other, while still feeling familiar. It takes talent to pull that off, that Lofstetter definitely has. In addition to that, I found the entire concept of the discontinued lines to be pretty cool, and I like how even after they were reintegrated, they were still second-class citizens for the sins of their fathers in the new caste system. And I liked all the interpersonal relationships and conflicts that were abound in the story. Seeing different versions of people still end up being friends, sort of a nature versus nurture thing going on. One thing I think is great is that the original Reginald Strafer, the one who discovered lick picks in the first place, is like primed as the protagonist. He's the first person we meet, and we basically spend his entire life with him as he oversees the project, and I got to really like him, and then we say goodbye, as he remains on Earth while the book follows the convoy out into the stars. Sort of a reversal of expectations, since I went into this blind and expected it to be following a single protagonist. It's a neat thing that really sets the story apart from others, similar to it in the sci-fi genre. Noumenon was a wild ride from start to finish. Some books take time to get into, and I thought that Noumenon was going to be one of those, based on the blurb and based on the fact that I have a million sci-fi books on my Kindle that I haven't made it past page 1 on. But once I oriented myself on, page 2, I was furiously flipping the pages until I got to the end. In fact, the day I finished it, and this is something I've never done, I immediately checked Amazon to find out if Lofstetter had done any other books, because I wanted to read more of her work regardless of what it was. She hasn't published any other books. She's done a lot of short stories. This was her debut novel. But it just so happens that fairly recently before that, aka 3 months earlier exactly, the sequel had been released, and I don't think there's been a sequel that I purchased faster. Usually I let the book marinate in my head for a little before I even consider buying the sequel unless I already own it or it's in a collection or omnibus, but this one I had to read immediately. I did eventually end up letting it marinate and took a break in the middle of reading Noumenon Infinity, but I think I'll save that anecdote for my eventual review of that book. This is a book whose pages are just begging to be turned after every twist and turn that the story takes. There's literally never a dull moment. Noumenon is amazing. It's probably one of the best sci-fi books I've read this year, maybe in my entire life. This is Marina J. Lofstetter's debut novel, which is just utterly mind-blowing, because it feels like this was written by one of the greats well into their established careers, with several books under their belt. She's written short stories before, but to undertake this as her first published novel, it is impressive. I didn't pay for this book, but I would have paid double the MSRP for it if I knew how much I was going to love it. It's similar in very many ways to Star Trek, which I love, and it should come as no surprise that Lofstetter, at least based on her Twitter, is also a Star Trek fan. So I have no verification, but I bet that influenced some of her writing. I think what I love most is how optimistic it is. As Reggie said of the convoy's genetic makeup being cloned, not utopia, but hopefully less chance of dystopia. Even the view of Earth in the future, while negative, seeing as humanity loses its exploratory spirit in the far future, is still better than most sci-fi. Earth is still there, humanity is still thriving. So I consider it a win. The handle that she has on this expansive universe that she created, that I had trouble even describing secondhand, is unparalleled. If anything I've said has at all intrigued you, and while I went a little more in depth than I was planning, there was a lot I left out, so if anything has piqued your interest, go check out this book. It is truly one of my favorite books I've ever read, and I don't usually use that term lightly. Like MASH? One of my favorite books, Hitchhiker's Guide. It's a classic. Noumenon. I wasn't expecting it to make the list so soon, but it totally deserves a spot on it. I highly recommend this book to any sci-fi fans out there looking for their next read. So go out, my viewers, buy this book or find it at your local library, and once you finish reading it, come back next week for a new episode of Black Scarab Films Presents, and then in 2 weeks, we'll be back here in the literary lair for a little special I'd like to call Creepypasta Double Feature. See you next time. Remember how enthusiastic I was about The Martian back in 2016? I feel pretty much the same about Noumenon, but I didn't want to rehash that same opening joke. So, anyway, this is Noumenon. No, there's something missing there. I feel pretty much the same way about Noumenon, but I didn't want to rehash that same opening joke. Anyway, I don't want to do... Shit. I never thought, because I was redoing the cake. Okay,